Hi everyone, and welcome back to another class on the Irish famine. Now, as you know, in the last class we went through the first two learning outcomes. So by now you should know different groups of people that lived in Ireland before the time of the Irish famine, and you should also know two facts about the workhouses. Now, in today's class, we're going to continue by doing the third learning outcome, and then we're going to be moving on to our new learning outcomes. So, by the end of today's class, you should know four causes of the Great Famine, and once we're finished that, I'll move on to the next set of learning outcomes. So when looking at the causes for the famine, I usually break it down into four separate categories. They are the rise in population in Ireland, the subdivision of land within Ireland, the overdependency on the potato, and the potato blight. So primarily, most people just focus on the potato blight, but it's important that you understand the four main causes for the Irish famine. So as we know, as the presentation started last week, the population rose. So the population rose from 1801 to 1841 by 3.5 million. Okay, so once the population rose, the need for food rose, and that food wasn't there to cater for the people. So that was one main reason. So as the population grew, people became poorer because they had to depend on the same amount of land and the same amount of crops. So here now we're jumping back to the look at the landlord's land. As we said, the landlord would have owned the joint box, and that would have been divided up by the middlemen who would have sublet it out to large tenant farmers and small tenant farmers. Now, as these farmers got older, they started to have their own kids, and they wanted to pass on these farms to their family. They want between either dowries or to their daughters, or else passing the farm down to sons. Now, if you take one of these acres here, so say now this plot of land here is 3 acres. I'll just grab a pen. As soon as the son will get married, the farmer might divide this into 1 acre for the son, and then in a dowry for his daughter, he might divide it again for the daughter. So now the farmer has to depend only on, let's say, 2 acres of land or even just 1 acre land, depending on how he divides it. So it's really important to understand how a farmer would become poorer as he had to divide up this land for his family. So as we know, during the famine, there was a huge dependency on the potato as a crop. Now, this was the primary or the main food of the people of Ireland, and as we learned from the Age of Exploration, once the potato had been brought into Ireland, it was used as one of the main food sources. Now, this was because it could feed a large family. You could grow a lot of potatoes on a small plot of land, as it says down here on the third point. It's important to know too that people back in the day, so a man would have eaten between 5 and 6 kilos of potatoes a day. So if you're in a shop there during the week or during the month, pop in and take a look at what 5 kilos of potatoes will be, and you'll actually be surprised by how many potatoes it is. It's a huge amount. Now, this was also the main reason why the population was growing, was because we had such a nourishing food resource. Okay, so it was a nourishing, and it was a great source of vitamin C. So eating all these potatoes was actually very good for the people back then, but we were overly dependent just on one food source. And the last cause for the famine is the blight. Now, a lot of you will already know about the blight, but basically what it is a rot that takes over a potato. So the potato might look grand on the outside, but once you cut it open, turns into this black mush that if you eat it, you'll start vomiting. So people at the time would have grown potatoes, the potatoes would have got blight, and or they were unable to eat it. Now, blight is a disease that attacks and rots a potato from the inside. Okay, so our learning outcomes for today's class is by the end of today's class, you should know two government responses to the failures of the potato crop in Ireland. during 1845. Now remember, if I say government responses, remember that we're not talking about the Irish government, we're talking about the English government because we were under English rule at the time. We should also know what laissez-faire means, and we should also know two government responses to the crisis in 1847. So remember those two dates. So we're looking at the two main responses between the dates of 1845 and 1847. Now, just taking a quick look at this timeline. So it takes a look at the timeline of the failure of the potato crop within Ireland. Now, I expect you all to take this down in your notes copy to make sure you all have a copy of the timeline throughout the 5 to 6 years that this potato blight happened. So in 1845, just starting us off there, a third of the crop was destroyed due to blight. Now, at the start of the year, any potatoes that were planted early survived, but any potatoes planted later on in the year died, or were, sorry, got blight through, and it caused a third of the crops to be destroyed and to be failed. In 1846, the entire crop was destroyed. So think about it, if the whole or the majority of the country were dependent on one crop and the entire crop were destroyed, this was devastating to a country. Okay. In 1847, less of the potatoes were destroyed. It wasn't as severe of a blight, but because so many people had actually eaten the seeds for potatoes because they were starving, it meant that there was actually less potatoes planted, so there was actually less grown. Okay, so less had been planted. Also, since so many people had died, there was less people actually working on farms. So less people, or sorry, more people died and more people emigrated. So it meant that there was less people to actually plant the crops. In 1848, three-quarters of the crops were destroyed, so this was another year to decimate the country. In 1849, the blight was less severe, and things were starting to look up from then. And in 1849, the blight was also similar, so it was less severe. So, how did the government respond, or how did the English government respond in 1845? So in 1845, the Prime Minister was Sir Robert Peel, and he imported 127 euros worth of maize. Oh, sorry, 127,000 pounds, it should have been, worth of maize into the country. Now, if you don't know what maize is, it's kind of like corn, it's like cereal, into the country. Now, the Irish couldn't cook it, and there were only 2 mills in the whole country capable of grinding this corn down. So they actually didn't have the means to actually cook this maize that was being sent in. Okay, now this became known as Peel's brimstone. So it was kind of the way that they used to talk about the actual mountain of maize that was sent in and that they couldn't actually use. Now, the Parliament at the time over in England seen this as charity, and it was actually frowned upon because they said that they were giving a handout to the Irish even though they weren't working for it, and back then charity wasn't actually seen as anything good. So it was actually frowned upon at the time. Now, this actually did help for a while, having this much maize, because they were able to grind down some of the maize and send it out to the people, but it was only a temporary solution. Another scheme that Peel set up was the Public Works Scheme. Now, this was where men were sent out to build roads and work on piers to earn money, as the government refused to give out charity. Now, we can see here one of the roads that they were created. These were set up because the actual Victorian era, they frowned upon charity and they didn't approve of it. This was an opportunity for people to earn money, but a lot of the time these roads led from nowhere to nowhere, so they were actually kind of pointless tasks. But it was just so that they would actually get jobs done instead of actually just handing out money. Then, as if things couldn't get much worse for the Irish. In 1846, Peel was replaced by Lord John Russell, as we can see here. Now, he really hated the idea of charity even more than Peel did, so he decided to stop importing all the maize into Ireland, and he wanted to adopt a laissez-faire approach or policy. Okay, I'll be explaining that in a second. Now, he also expanded the public work scheme, and he wanted people to work for the money that was being sent over. So what was the laissez-faire policy? Now, this is one of the learning outcomes, so it's very important. The laissez-faire policy didn't believe that the government should get involved in people's day-to-day lives, and things naturally worked out themselves out, that they naturally worked themselves out. They believed that it would be unethical for the government to intervene, and that helping the poor would only make them lazier and more dependent. Now, this is an absolute disgusting kind of approach to running a country or to governing a country, and it's just kind of to show you how the English viewed or policies were created at the time and their views towards other countries that they colonized. Okay, so the laissez-faire approach, it was kind of like sitting back and not taking ownership of their responsibilities, even though they actually sent over many different people to do research and to actually do audits of the country to see how it was getting on, and they fully understood the severity of Ireland and what it was going through. So a man responsible of handing out the public relief was a man called Sir Charles Trevelyan. Now, he believed in divine intervention, and he thought that this was God's plan and God's work, creating a famine to affect any of the uneducated Irish. So this kind of goes back to the whole ideals of the plantations, where they wanted to change the Irish to convert them to Protestants and to educate them and get rid of their language. He seen this as a direct stroke of um, of an all-wise and all-merciful province, that this would wipe out any of the uneducated Irish and only leave the ones that were willing to become British subjects. Now, times actually got so bad that they had to reintroduce the public works scheme. So the public works scheme was enlarged by the end of 1846. Up to 750,000 people were employed by these schemes. Now, a lot of these roads, people would actually have to walk 10, 20 miles just to get out to start making these roads, and they were only on an actual work scheme that you'd actually be paid by how productive you were. Now, if you think about it, if you haven't eaten for 3 or 4 days, you're just after walking 10 to 20 kilometers out to this one road, and all of a sudden you're getting paid by how productive you're going to be. You probably won't be that productive if you're that hungry. A lot of people actually didn't even make it out to the roads, that they died of starvation walking out to these roads. And this is what are known as the Famine Roads. You'll see a lot of these in Enniscorthy, in West Cork. A lot of the roads you'll travel on are actually old famine roads. Now, after the crops failed again in 1846, the Quakers, or a Society of Friends, set up soup kitchens around Ireland. So this was to try help the people. Now, this was a charitable thing. It was only a private sort of industry. It wasn't set up by the government. These were a massive success, but limited to only a few areas. Now, this led to the Soup Kitchen Act that was set up by the English government in 1847 to try feed the population because so many people were dying. Okay, so it's important to remember that in 1846 the Quakers set up the first of the soup kitchens, and in the next class we're going to be looking into 1847 and why it's so influential. And going back to the workhouses, as we looked at in the last class, the workhouses were totally over full. They were only meant to have a full capacity of 1,000 spaces, but they had crammed 200,000 into workhouses. So they were double their capacity by 1847. Now later on in 1847, the government set up outdoor relief. So with an extra an extra million people desperately looking for food, the government set up outdoor relief, which were outdoor soup kitchens to try feed the population. Now that brings us back to our learning outcomes. So by the end of this class, what you should know by now, you should know 2 government responses to the failures of the potato crop in Ireland in 1845. You should know what laissez-faire means, and you should also know 2 government responses to the crisis in 1847.